Thank you. All right, so I'm going to get started, okay? Hold on 1 second. Oh, give me 1 second. Somebody just sent me an email that they wanted to get the link, so give me 1 minute. Hold on. Minute. Okay. All right, we're now live. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Well, thank you, Gloria, for responding to that. It's wonderful to have everybody learning together. And as we've learned over the course of the past almost 2 years, even when something is virtual, it's real. You can learn a lot of Torah virtually. And one of the benefits, of course, is also been able to have lectures and talks out of Israel. And I want to thank Harvey Kaminsky for really connecting me with Sam Koenig, who is one of the key people in Bar Ilan University and in fostering the relationship between Israel and the American Jewish community. And we had a lecture from one of the professors at Bar Ilan University, and we were trying to identify a way to strengthen that relationship. And we decided this year to have kind of a special partnership between Bar Ilan University and Agudas Shalom. This may be the first of such partnerships between the university and a synagogue in America, where it's not just one class, but rather it's a series of courses or classes really over the course of the year. So we are truly blessed to have with us Professor Baruch Barzel. In Israel right now, for him, it's like 4 a.m. Just kidding. He's actually in Boston right now on a sabbatical. I was going to try to give you extra credit for that one. And we want to thank you for coming. We told him that this is the first of like 8-part series. So he really thinks that he's the first candle that's being lit. No pressure, but we're really happy to have you here. He's here in America for a year, living in Boston and Brookline with his wife and 2 children, correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, thank God, beautiful, and Hashem should give you much joy and much nachas while you're in America and always. I'll give a brief bio, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Barzel, who will speak for about 25 or so minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. Professor Baruch Barzel is a physicist and applied mathematician, director of the Complex Network Dynamics Lab at Bar Ilan University. His main research areas are statistical physics, complex systems, nonlinear dynamics, and network science. Okay.
I see the participant list dwindling as you're reading that out.
Barzel completed his PhD in physics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Israel, as a Hoffman Fellow. He then pursued his postdoctoral training at the Center for Complex Network Research at Northeastern University and at the Channing Division of Network Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's an active public lecturer, presenting a weekly segment on Jewish thought on Israel National Radio. His research focuses on the dynamic behavior of complex networks, with applications ranging from disease spreading in social networks to brain and biological systems and infrastructure resilience. Professor Barzel is the recipient of the Rakat Prize, the Rector Prize for Scientific Innovation, and of the Krill Prize on behalf of the Wolf Foundation. So I'm already intrigued, and I'm looking forward to first even understanding your bio. That would be like a good first step, and then you can give your presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for this opportunity to open this segment of 8 lectures from Bar Ilan. Thank you to Sam for coordinating all this. And thank you all for coming. I know it's evening time. It's not 4 a.m. I'm here in Boston, as the Rabbi said, but still it's an effort to, for the attention. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. And I want to start our story in the year 2003. Back then, a blackout is, something gets stuck here. Okay, here we go. So I want to start this story in 2003, where a minor mishap in South Canada propagated to become one of the largest blackouts in history. Now, this, of course, speaks to the potential vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, but in a broader perspective, it illustrates the crucial role.
Oh, by the way, Professor
complex.
Professor
Yes.
Barzel, I'm going to put everybody on mute except for you, okay?
Oh, okay.
It's just a little easier that way. Okay, go ahead. Now you can unmute yourself and speak. Okay.
Myself. So we're back to this blackout. I hope now you hear me better. So this doesn't just illustrate the potential vulnerability of the critical infrastructure, but it also portrays for us the crucial role that complex networks play in what I think are the most pressing modern challenges, from understanding biological mechanisms in the cell, to understanding the functionality of our brain, to ensuring the resilience of our infrastructure networks. And we've all become experts in the past year and a half, understanding and predicting the spread of viruses on social networks. So we're all experts on that now. And the idea is that if we want to predict the next collapse or the next outbreak, or better yet, if we want to prevent it, we need to understand the behavior of all of these networks. Now, to do this, I want to take a step back. Rabbi introduced me as the director of the Complex System Dynamics Lab. So let's talk about what a complex system is. Now, most people, when I tell them that what I research is complex system, they change the subject, they start talking about the weather, but well, you're a captive audience for now, so let me tell you what a complex system is. Most people would look at this picture and see a car. Because I was brought up as a physicist, I'm inclined to see here not just a car, but what I call a macroscopic system. How do I know this is a macroscopic system? Because I can tear it down into its microscopic components. But here's the point. I could have done the same thing with a big boulder. When you tear down a boulder, a rock, a big rock into its microscopic components, what you find is that a big rock is actually composed of many, many small rocks. But when you do it to a car, it's different. The basic building blocks of a car are not small cars. They don't know how to do anything that a car does. They can't steer a wheel, they can't operate the brakes. So a car is actually the result of a cooperation of many, many basic components, simple building blocks that come together to lead to much more complex behavior. Now, that doesn't surprise us about the car because the car is engineered to foster this cooperation. But we see many systems in nature that have this exact property, where simple building blocks come together to provide complex behavior. Let's just think about a few examples. We mentioned them in the previous slide, but now we can look at them again. I think we will all agree that our brain is a complex system. But what makes it a complex system? So in the language we just talked about, it all has to do with macroscopic versus microscopic. The basic building blocks of the brain are the neurons. The average adult human being has roughly 100 billion neurons. Maybe here there's a little bit more, I don't know, okay? But when you put 100 billion neurons together, you do not get a big neuron. You get a completely new system because none of the neurons knows how to think, how to operate our motor or our sensory skills, but together we're somehow able to do that. So simple building blocks lead together to complex behavior. Our biological cells are all complex systems because you put together 20,000 genes, you don't get a big gene, you get a completely new system. The internet is not just a big computer, it's bigger than the sum of its parts. And of course, society, our social networks, where we started with the spread of viruses. So individual people, in that sense, are simple building blocks. Yeah, I know, every person is a whole world. But from a societal perspective, an individual is a building block. When you put them together, you get society, which, as we see now, has emergent behaviors that cannot be easily extrapolated from the behavior of every one of the individuals. So simple building blocks lead together to very complex behaviors. This is the motto in our lab: more is different. Okay, you put simple components together and they build a picture which is much more complex when you look at it from afar.
Dr. Barzel, are you supposed to be moving the slides or it's always on that? I wasn't sure if you were moving.
My slides are moving. You're not seeing them moving?
No,
You
we're
should see
not.
more
Yeah,
of
yeah.
these now.
No, our slides are not moving.
Oh, that's a shame. I had so many good visuals there. How
I
about
think
now? Do you see anything?
we just see your initial slide. I don't know if you want to, that's weird. We're not
Let's
seeing anything move.
rewind back and I'll do the stop share and I'll share again. This is very strange, of course.
Oh, there we
see
go.
now.
That's better. Yeah. Now we can see.
Okay, so now I'm going to go fast through all the visuals and you're going to retrospectively understand everything I said. Okay, is it advancing now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So I'm sorry for that. And it's a good thing you mentioned it. I can go through the whole talk without knowing that you're not seeing all the visuals that all the cues that I'm giving you here. So we are thinking on a complex system is that you take simple components, but they come together to portray a much more complex picture. And here's a point to take a step back and think for a second. So what is the secret? What does the brain have that its simple building blocks, 100 billion neurons, don't? Well, I've already mentioned the answer. Some of you are already thinking about it because I misled you. I said that the brain is just 100 billion neurons coming together, but that's not enough. The brain is 100 billion neurons connected together through a complex network of interactions. And here's the fundamental paradigm of the researching on that, is that at the heart of every complex system, there is a network that captures how the underlying components, how the simple building blocks interact. So one neuron can transfer information to another neuron, activate it or deactivate it. And in this way, the brain becomes bigger than the sum of its parts. So if we want to understand, if we want to predict the behavior, and ultimately, if we want to influence the behavior of our biological, social, or technological networks, we need to understand what their underlying networks look like. We need to map the wiring diagram of the social system, the wiring diagram of our biological systems, the wiring diagram of our brains, and of our infrastructure systems. So let's see a couple of things that we can do from a network perspective. We'll start with the most pressing challenge. Let's talk about epidemics. What you see here in the middle, and I hope you are seeing my slides advancing. So you should be seeing the black playing in the middle. Rabbi, please tell me you're with me on the same slide.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. What you see here in the middle is a projection of the propagation of the Black Plague. Now, if I were an epidemiologist back in the Middle Ages, it would seem that I have a very easy job because the Black Plague advances very predictably. It starts at the south around Sicily and Turkey and roughly conquers 10 to 20 miles a day as it propagates up north. Why 10 to 20 miles a day? That's approximately what a horseman would ride on a given day. And they were the ones that actually create this wave of propagating disease throughout Europe. But if we look at a modern epidemic, well, we don't ride horses anymore. And our modern transportation is much more complicated. So modern epidemics, as we all know now, they travel through air traffic and then through local transportation like trains and cars. And the picture becomes way less predictable than that of the Black Plague. In fact, when we project it on our actual transportation networks, we find that the picture is something more like what you see down here. You see the emergence of the virus in all sorts of locations. It's much more difficult to predict where the virus will be tomorrow, in 2 days, or in a week from now. But back in 2019, we took this challenge, not just for epidemics, but in general, for how things travel in a network environment. And we wrote a paper which colloquially we called it the network GPS. The idea is that once we have a map of the network, we can start navigating it. Viruses travel on a social network, like cars travel on a road network. That doesn't mean that it's mathematically the same, but we can use the same mathematical toolbox to describe both patterns of information propagation. And what this allows us to do is create a network GPS. A GPS may tell you that New York, or say Brooklyn and Queens, are much farther away than say Albany and I don't know, Cornell, because the GPS doesn't just look at the structure of the road, it translates the structure of the road into the actual patterns of propagation. It knows where are the bottlenecks, where are the traffic jams, where are the freeways. A similar analysis in networks allowed us to achieve this graph over here. All the mess that we see on the left, very unpredictable type of behavior, once we lay it out based on our prediction, suddenly we see that there is some hidden structure behind that mess. And what exposed this hidden structure is the mathematics of complex networks, our understanding of how to lay out the different locations in a meaningful way that is not just by their distance, but by the actual propagation time, not of the cars, it's not a real GPS, the actual propagation times of the pathogens that travel through the social and transportation network. What's the vision? The vision is that once we have this network language by which to understand how viruses propagate in a social network, we can forecast the spread of a global epidemic. And what's more important is design strategies to influence this spread. Now, this paper was published back in 2019. It's work that has been going on in my lab since 2015. So nobody talked about COVID when we published this paper. That was not even on our minds. It was back then a theoretical question about epidemic spreading. But since COVID broke out, of course, the first thing we did is we took part of our lab, a significant part of our lab, and digressed it into trying to design influential strategies to exit COVID-19. And at some point, I was part of the committee that advised the Israeli government. And so we got a lot of data, and my lab all participated and did white nights in trying to think of new ideas to advise the government and to run simulations to see how these ideas will work. And we came up with something which I think was very interesting. Some of you might have heard about it because it was a simple strategy, but we experienced what's called in the scientific field a media tsunami. So for 15 minutes, not 15 minutes, for about a month and a half, my house became a headquarters. And we were talking to journalists and politicians and policymakers and governments all over the world about our strategy, which we call alternating quarantine. I'm not going to go into the details about this strategy because it's not the topic of this talk. I might say something about it later if you're interested, but what I'm mainly proud of in this strategy is not just that it got a lot of attention. It was our first meaningful attempt to take the theoretical science we do in the lab and bring something which is practically applicable to real world, very, very crucial and pressing challenge. And we put together a team of economists and social scientists and psychologists to devise a way to take this from the math into actual implementation. And what I'm most proud of is that, unfortunately, no country has adopted this strategy as a national level, because most countries didn't adopt any strategy at a national level. So we're in good hands on that note. But it was implemented partially. For example, schools in Austria adopted this strategy, and we ran some simulations for them to show them exactly how to do it. Big corporations like Loise, a German corporation of several tens of thousand workers, adopted this strategy. So yes, I would be happy if this would be a national strategy which a country would actually do to exit COVID-19. But if a big corporation was able to prevent infections, but on the other hand, go back to work and not lay off thousands of workers using our alternating quarantine strategy, to me, that is a lot of fulfillment. Not just writing the paper, but actually creating something that impacts someone's life outside of the walls or the boundaries of the lab. But we've all heard for the past year and a half so much about epidemic spreading. Let's go a little bit above that. Let's go beyond that to other challenges, which I believe network science can provide us a key to opening the locked box. This is considered in biology and in medicine one of the most pessimistic graphs that has been recently published. To be honest, when I looked at it, I actually thought it was good news, but people corrected me. You see, what it shows on the x-axis is the years going by, and on the y-axis, the number of new drugs that are being discovered every year. As you can see, there is a constant decline in the number of new drugs that are discovered. So if you're optimistic like I am, you say, wow, this is great news. We are eradicating so many diseases that there are just no drugs to be discovered. But when I showed this to my biologist friends, they assured me that that's not the story. And they're struggling to understand why innovation in drug discovery is in a constant decline. Now, I want you to look at these years, 1950 to 2010. Those are the decades of biology. We have discovered the double helix. We have decoded the human genome. We have cloned Dolly the sheep. Those were years where our understanding of everything that has to do with our genetic system was boosted greatly. And still that did not translate to the discovery of new drugs. Or that's maybe an overstatement, but it didn't translate efficiently enough to the discovery of new drugs. From a network science perspective, we look at it a bit differently. Because remember, network science is not about the microscopic components. It's about how these microscopic components come together to provide a complex behavior. What the decoding of the human genome does is actually map out the building blocks, the Lego bricks of the cell. So understanding the genes is providing you with the list of parts. But no engineer can look at the list of parts of a car, roughly 10 to 15,000, almost like the number of genes we have in a cell. No engineer can just look at the list of parts that compose a car and understand from that how to actually operate a car. What you need is not just a list of parts. You need the wiring diagram. If you have the wiring diagram, you can start understanding how these parts come together. And that is precisely mapping the network and producing the mathematical tools to translate this network mapping into an understanding of the mechanisms that go on in the cell. I'll give you just one example. Many people don't know that, but drug discovery, and if there are biologists in the crowd, I am oversimplifying here. But to a certain extent, drug discovery is searching for a needle in a haystack. These are your genes, these are your proteins. You know that this protein is associated with a disease. You're now looking for a molecule that can impact this protein. It's really looking for a needle in a haystack. But networks can very simply allow us to understand not just the specific protein you want to target, but what other proteins or what other genes interact, transfer information, impact that protein. It expands your search space and says, you don't just need to target the specific protein, look at its environment. In a sense, it pinpoints the area in the network or the area in the haystack where you're supposed to be looking. And we find, for example, that when we use the networks, not just looking at a gene or a protein, but looking at its neighbors and its next neighbors and trying to understand from the network pathways how you can indirectly affect that protein, we can go from a discovery rate with a 1% success. Now, if you're in economy or in physics, 1% success is considered terrible, right? I mean, you want much more than that. But the whole question is, what is your baseline? If you're blindly looking, you might just have a fraction of a percent of success. 1% success can be doing 100 times better. Let's put the dollar figure on that. Imagine that it takes a single drug to be discovered, an investment of $1 million. This is a real, tremendous underestimate. So for $1 million, you're able to discover one drug. Why does it cost so much? Because you had to look in many, many different locations. If you are now able to get a 1% success rate, do 100 times better, it means that for $1 million, you can now discover 100 drugs. Every one will only cost you $10,000. So you're still looking for a needle in the haystack, but not me. Network science just made this haystack 100 times smaller and increased your chances of success or your rate of success by a factor of 100. I'm going to talk about our last application, and I think exactly on time. We talked about social networks and the spread of viruses, and we talked about biological networks and the discovery of new drugs. I'm going to talk now about something which I know in the US is a very pertinent issue, and that is the resilience of infrastructure. Remember 2003, the big blackout in New York, maybe it also impacted Connecticut, I'm not even sure, but I know that many people in the East Coast remember this personally. What changed since then? It's been 18 years or almost 19 years since then. What has actually changed? Well, I would argue that three things have changed. One, today, there's no such thing as a major blackout. Today, such a big blackout will also cause an internet failure and a communications failure. Everything is interconnected. If the internet fails, then all our traffic infrastructure fails, our hospitals fail. It's a major interconnected world of all our infrastructure systems, and a blackout at that scale that occurred in 2003, if that occurs in 2021, it's a whole different ballpark. That's one thing that has changed. The second thing that has changed since 2003 is that we're not only worried today about local disturbances, overloads, or weather events. We're also worried about cyber attacks. And cyber attacks can use the network to strategically attack specific Achilles heels in the system. And the third thing that happens over the last 18 years since the blackout of 2003 is that our infrastructure got 18 years older, not necessarily any stronger or more resilient. So once again, I cannot compete with an engineer in understanding power components. So one option is to make the components stronger, to make the wires more viable, to make the poles more weather resistant, to make the transformators more load resistant. That would be strengthening the components. What we can also do is look at it from a network perspective. Can we identify specific areas in the network that are at risk? Maybe that's where you should invest. Maybe that's where you should protect. There's no way to protect the entire power system or the whole internet, but identifying specific bottlenecks and Achilles heels can help us prioritize. And of course, the main thing, and this is a project that we have now entered with Israeli power company. I mean, they're funding us and we are trying to provide results, is once the blackout occurs, since we already have our network GPS, we can predict how it propagates through the system. Now notice, we started by predicting how viruses propagate along the social network, and now we're talking about how disturbances or local failures propagate on the power system. I'm not saying that these two things are the same thing. Of course they're not. But we can use the same mathematical toolbox, the same family of equations to describe both propagations. And if we know the patterns of propagation, then we can design real-time strategy for intervention. Blackouts are big, they're sudden, but they do not occur instantaneously. From the minute there's a failure in Canada until the whole East Coast is in the dark, it takes 6, 7 hours, maybe 10 hours. In 10 hours, nobody can chase it and fix things on the go. But what we can do is devise an algorithm that will shut down strategic points along the way before the overload occurs. And this real-time intervention, if we understand the network, if we know where are the free flows and the bottlenecks in the network, we can design a case where we shut down strategically 10% of the nodes, but save the remaining 90% from failure. So, as I said, I cannot compete with a biologist in understanding genes. I cannot compete with a virologist in understanding viruses, or with a sociologist in understanding human behavior, or with an engineer in understanding power grid components. But we have a different tool. We look at it from the above. And when you look at the network, you find that all of these systems, they follow a universal mathematical framework that can help us uncover biological mechanisms and design drugs, mitigate the spread of epidemics, understand the functionality of the brain, and ensure the resilience of our critical infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Wow. Excellent.
I just need to say, I'm not alone on this. I'm proud to say that Bar-Ilan is, I think, one of the leading institutions worldwide, not just in Israel, when it comes to network science. And we're a whole team. Every one of us has their lab, and we collaborate. Everyone brings their different expertise because this is a very interdisciplinary topic, as you can understand. So I need to acknowledge my peers at Bar-Ilan, which are just doing excellent work on this.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just raise a question, and people should feel free to ask as well. If you were to project out, let's say like 10 years from now, and everything would go with your research exactly as you planned, where would you like to see this kind of field taking Israel and the world, and what are some of the benefits we might see?
So in 10 years, what I think, what my lab would aspire to achieve in 10 years is an understanding of the behavior of networks, which is analogous to our understanding of particle systems. You see, in physics, we have these complex systems all the time. We have particle systems, and particles behave in one way. When you put many particles together, you get completely different behaviors. And we have that very well mapped out. So in physics, we know how to go from the rules of the particles to understanding why a glass of water boils at 100 degrees. I think we should have the same level of prediction and the same level of ability to observe all of these complex systems. That I can look at viruses, at disease spreading as particles exchanging viruses, exchanging information in the form of a virus, genes exchanging information, again, particles that exchange information in the form of biochemical signals, neurons exchanging information in the form of electrical signals, or power grid components exchanging information in the form of overloads. And I want to understand this just like we understand the Newton's laws of how particles interact.
Thank you. Well, Godspeed on that. Would anyone like to ask other questions to Dr. Barzel? Toby, you have to unmute. Yep.
Yeah, Dr. Barzel, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm wondering if, and I guess this is, if you weren't from Israel, maybe this wouldn't even cross my mind, but since you are, I think that everything somehow has some implication. Has your work in any way been utilized by Israel or by other countries in the realm of security, military, that kind of intelligence, that sort of thing?
Several answers to this. Let's first of all say that my work directly, to the best of my knowledge, has not been used, but there is a lot of research in my surrounding, and I see it. It's not specifically what I research in my lab, but there's a lot of research in understanding, for example, a terrorist organization or any adversarial entity as a network. Because what you can follow from an intelligence perspective is just who talks to whom over cell phones. So you're blind, all you know is the network structure. And from that, you can deduce the patterns of information propagation. And this way of thought has been very active, and there's a lot of research into understanding organizations, specifically also adversarial organizations, by just mapping out their network, just like you map out the genetic network, without really understanding all the intricacies that go on within the organization. And I can tell you of one very known success of this approach. It's an oldie, but a goodie. Saddam Hussein was captured in Iraq. This was, when network science was just in its embryonic stages. But that was one of the first applications. They used the communication network. And from that, they deduced that if Saddam Hussein is still getting information anywhere from someone, there are these two people that have to know where he is. And they used network analysis to find these people, and that's how they captured him. Today, I know that in West Point, network science is one of the courses that they must learn. And this was like the inaugural application. On top of that, when we talk about cybersecurity, then again, cybersecurity is attacked in two fronts. Most innovation today in cybersecurity is about the components. How do you protect the computer? How do you make sure that the wires don't let information go out? So you talk about the components. What is emerging today, and this is, you don't see a lot of innovation there today, but you will see, I believe, in the next years, is understanding that cybersecurity is also a network problem. It's not just about securing the components. It's about understanding what are the vulnerable points in your network structure and which points you should protect more or less. How can you utilize the network to counteract the cyber attack as it unfolds? Questions like that are only just emerging. And from my perspective as a network scientist, they provide a completely new view on this. It's not about the components. It's about the macroscopic picture and the way these components interact.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question as well. Diane Indike. I'd like to
Yeah,
thank you for your talk. It has been fascinating. Can you expand a little bit on this idea of the alternating quarantine?
Sure. That was an invited question. I'll keep it very short and simple. The idea is this: we were asking ourselves in the lab, why is the virus spreading so violently? Despite the fact this was the first wave of the epidemic back then, but it's also true today, that we are vigorously isolating the sick, right? I mean, today, if someone has a fever or coughs, definitely back then, when the epidemic just started, nobody's going to be in contact with him. And if he has any more severe symptoms, they're in isolation. So the trick that the virus has, of course, is that before you develop symptoms, you're already infectious. And the timescales are around 1 week, they're roughly 5 days. So once you contract the virus, within the first 5 days, you do not develop symptoms. But at the end of these 5 days, the last 2 days, you're already infecting others. So I may be infected, and I may already be infecting others. Remember, back then, no vaccines, nothing around, but I don't know that I'm infected yet. So I'm not careful around my peers, they're not careful around me. And that is the secret of this virus. It's not the only virus that does that, but that is a problem with this virus. If the symptoms were showing right away, it would be much easier to contain. So what we decided is to use this weapon that the virus has against it. It goes like this. You take society, imagine the community in the show, okay? You take the society, you partition it into 2 cohorts. Cohort number 1, the red group, cohort number 2, the blue group. And then you have them alternating between activity and isolation in weekly succession. So in week number 1, group number 1, they go to work, their children go to school, they eat in restaurants, they do everything they want to do. Of course, they should be careful, maybe wear masks and things, but they can keep their socio-economic activity. That's the main point. Group number 2 at that point stays at home. And then after a week, they switch. And the reason that this works so well in the places that actually tried it is because we are using the natural cycles of the virus against it. Because if you were infected in week number 1, when you were active, then you're becoming your most dangerous point. You're now an invisible spreader because you don't have symptoms yet, but you might already be infecting others. But here's the point. In week number 2, you enter isolation. By the end of week number 2, you've either developed symptoms or you're no longer dangerous. So by week number 3, you can resume your schedule, or if you develop symptoms, enter isolation. It's like a ratchet movement. So the idea is that the virus has a natural cycle, and in physics, we call this anti-resonance. We use the same cycle of the virus, which is 5 days, roughly a week, to alternate between activity, and we counteract the spread. Now, if the entire society works like that, then within 2 or 3 weeks, you've really pruned out all the infected individuals, and you get a predominantly clean society. Of course, society is not perfect. So, I mean, our whole task was, A, how to implement this, how to enforce this, and how well does it perform in the face of imperfect behavior, not full cooperation. And on all fronts, the answer was very clear. It's the best performing method. It's the only method that affords you continuous socioeconomic activity. You're only isolated half the time, but the other half you're active, okay? Alongside an extremely efficient mitigation of the spread.
Wow.
That's a fascinating answer. I assume you tracked this in Austria? Is it Austria or the German company where you implemented this?
Right. So this was, as I said, this was implemented. Israel implemented this as a going back to school strategy. Austria, France, industrialists in Argentina implemented this. From most of them, I'm sad to say that we don't have data to actually test how well it performed. But there is light at the end of that tunnel. This big corporation in Germany that adopted this method as a back to work strategy, we just contacted them and they are willing to share with us data. And that will help us create a test case to see if our prediction that, you know, you get infected in week number 1, you sit out your peak infectious period in week number 2 and go back to work in week number 3, we will hopefully be able to test that on their data. It's not as easy as it sounds, but maybe in a couple of months we will have a case study to show that it doesn't only work in theory, but also in practice.
Dr. Lloyd Contract for Good Shalom.
Yeah.
I have a question. Since viruses are incomplete cells, and so in themselves can't survive without a host, because they need the host
Yeah.
components that they don't have. So how does having all these networks understood prevent the propagation from one host to the other, and that causes the spread of the virus?
Yeah. So we now have a paper coming out soon exactly on that. It's about what happens when there is an active viral spread alongside the fact that the virus can also evolve as it replicates. Once again, look at the Delta variant, look at the Gamma variant. We're experiencing this right now. But again, this paper was on the works since 2018. Before the pandemic ever started, it just became extremely relevant. And that actually delayed its publication because we decided to wait and actually gather data on COVID-19 and, use the fact that it's no longer theoretical to make the paper more grounded and better. In principle, viruses, they do 2 things. You contract them as a host, and then they replicate inside your body. Okay, that's stage number 1. Once you have enough viruses in your body, you can start shedding them on others by breathing, if the virus is airborne, or by exchanging of fluids, like little drops that you exert from all your cavities. And the idea is that the virus cannot survive for a long time outside the host body, but it also doesn't die right away. If it would die right as it exits the host body, then viruses would have a very hard time spreading. But it does survive to some extent outside the host body, and that's what allows it to infect. So if I breathed in the room and you entered the room an hour later, maybe you're fine. But if you were there within 5 or 10 minutes and contracted my breath particles, you can definitely contract the virus. Part of the evolution that the virus undergoes that allows it to spread better is an extended lifetime outside the host body. It's very important for viruses to be able to survive for as long as they can outside the host body. Otherwise, no transmission. Or only transmission through, blood injections, or, like AIDS, for example, cannot survive even for a minute outside the host body. So you can only contract AIDS by very intimate and direct exchange of body fluids. So, or rabies is another example, right? You need to be bit. It's not enough that the dog breathes in your vicinity. So some viruses that really cannot live outside the host for a second, they need to find another mode of transportation.
Part 2 of that question. Now, in the event that you have a virus like the COVID-19, it has another name, but however, let's suppose, do you feel in your research that this virus will become somewhat like an endemic style of a virus where there's always going to be a host lurking in the background someplace and keep propagating this virus into different mutations? I keep thinking of the flu. I mean, every year we get a flu inoculation, and you hope that what's in the serum works for that flu season. It was a 65% chance that it will. And I'm just wondering whether or not you, in your understanding of this global endemics, will this virus become like an endemic? In other words, it'll always be around, you'll have flare-ups in various places, and never really ever eliminate it.
Yeah, so the answer is, what do we mean when we say endemic? The difference between endemic and pandemic is that we think of endemic as a controlled level of prevalence throughout society. In principle, all the viruses around us are endemic, and COVID-19, the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus is not going to be an exception. It's going to remain endemic. It's not going to be eradicated. And by endemic, we actually mean what are the standards that we set that we're willing to live with. So let's take another endemic disease that we know about, the bubonic plague. Okay, it's there, cholera or Ebola. All of these viruses are still around us.
Yeah.
The level of toleration that we have for the endemicity of these viruses is very, very low. If there's an outbreak of Ebola tomorrow in Boston, we are so intolerant to Ebola that we will quarantine Boston and take any measures we can to avoid the spread. It means that we keep Ebola in an endemicity which is very low. Our bar is very small. We will quarantine people right away if Ebola outbreaks in the US. For flu, if there's a big outbreak of flu, we might take measures. We might say school is out, but we keep it at an endemic level of roughly 5 to 10% of the population every winter, and that's tolerated. How much COVID-19 we can tolerate is the question of endemicity. It depends on us. It's not a characteristic of the virus. It's what is a reasonable percentage? There will be, even after the big waves are gone, 2, 3, 4 years from now, there will be local outbreaks of COVID-19. And we might decide to put a city on quarantine to make sure it doesn't flow beyond. That's endemicity, and it's our decision. It's a matter of values, not a matter of epidemiology.
Thank you, Lloyd. Your questions. Any other thoughts? Well, Professor Barzel, thank you so much for your time tonight. I mean, it's a brave new world, and just the whole notion of network science and how something which is mathematical and scientific really affecting us on a daily basis with real life issues, I think is very inspiring. And also, just I want to emphasize the importance of Bar-Ilan University. One of the reasons Agudas Shalom was partnering with Bar-Ilan is because in many ways it represents, it's one of the universities that really tries to synthesize Judaism and Mada and science and create a real framework for synthesis, very much like Yeshiva University that many of us are familiar with. Bar-Ilan is really a shining light, not only in Israel, but for the entire world. So it's an honor to be able to host you tonight. We wish you again much hatzlacha. We thank everybody for joining, and happy Thanksgiving. You get some turkey since you're in America now. And
we got the turkey, yes. We're gonna make an attempt on a turkey.
And
If
happy
you
Hanukkah.
get one shot at it, I hope I'm not gonna blow it. I volunteer to make it.
All right, well, enjoy. Happy Hanukkah and happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thank you so much. And I want to
Thank
acknowledge
you.
also Toby, our president. I want to also acknowledge Marina, who is the chair of our adult ed, for always being so focused and organized and inspired to bring a lot of wonderful education programs to our community. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye.
Good night.